This video is now in session, and it's inevitable. The Democrats will lose their trifecta in 2022. At this point, what we're seeing is that not really much has changed from the time that Biden lost his honeymoon period back in August of 2021, when the Afghanistan war was coming to an end and the Biden administration botched that effort. From then, we have had a lot happen: debt crisis, as in a government shutdown crisis, as well as inflation, and even a war in Ukraine. But none of that has really fundamentally changed the calculus for Biden's approval rating and the overall rating of Democrats in Congress. What we see is that at this point, Republicans are keeping their lead over the Democrats in congressional polls. So it's more than likely that we will see the House go to the Republican Party. Now, the question that many have been thinking is how much? How much will the Democrats lose by? And will it be something like 2010 or 1994? Because if we've seen in past elections, in 2010, for example, Obama, if we look at his approval rating when he was president for the first 2 years, between 2008 and 2010, what you'll see is that he had an approval rating of 45%. That means he had a net negative approval rating of at most 4.4%. Compare that to what's happening right now with Biden, which is negative 11.3%, and you might start to get worried, especially if, as a Democrat at least, if you're a Republican, you have elation because Biden is not doing good, and it's highly likely that the Republicans will take control of the House. But Democrats are worried because what we see in 2010 is that with a negative approval rating of 4.4%. The Republicans were able to gain 63 seats in the House to get a 242-seat majority, which is one of the biggest gains they've ever made. In Bill Clinton's presidency, when he was president between 1992 and 1994, what we see is that his net negative approval rating was around, at most, negative 9.7%. And right now, Biden is at 11.3%. But if you translate that to the actual 1994 election, what you'll see is that Newt Gingrich made substantial gains in the House in that year, by around 54 seats between 1992 and 1994, which gave them a 230-seat majority. So should the Democrats really be worried this time around? There are causes for concern, especially because there is such a tight majority that the Democrats have right now, which is 222. But it's not going to be as big in magnitude, I think, as 2010 or 1994. The reason is because the Democrats already have such a narrow majority that it basically means that most of their seats are fortified, or at least a big chunk of it. For example, a lot of these districts in the New England region are pretty fortified. And what we saw in 2008 was that the Democrats started with a huge majority in the House, comprised of members in Congress Democrats in Congress who came from absolutely bizarre places. Like, you wouldn't expect a Democrat to be from Idaho, yet in 2008, Idaho, one of Idaho's districts, I believe the first district, elected a Democrat to Congress. So these kinds of odd elections to Congress back in 2008 and 1992, a lot of those seats were forced to go away in 2010 and 1994. But what we see now is that there aren't as many competitive districts as there were back in 2010. If we look at these elections and if we go back to previous results, basically what we see is that for the most part, the Democrats, a lot of their seats were above 5 percentage points. So that's one factor, which is that the Democrats already don't have that many competitive seats. the other factor is that polarization has grown on both sides between 2010 and now. Back in 2010, Republicans were angry at the Democrats, especially Tea Party Republicans. But the inverse wasn't quite as true. There wasn't really much hatred of the Democrats towards people of the Republican Party. But fast forward that to today, and we see a stark difference, which is that a lot of people in the Democratic Party simply don't like people of the Republican Party, and the same goes the other way around. So it will be a lot easier for the Democrats, for the Democratic politicians to rally their supporters to at least vote for them and prevent a Republican majority, even though there will inevitably be one. So ultimately, there's not really much damage that the Republicans can do to decrease the Democrats' majority all the way down to 160 seats or even 180 seats. What we're likely to see is that there'll be maybe about 30 or so flips at most in the 2022 election. Now, obviously, a lot can change from now, but from now until the midterm elections. But if we've seen from past polls of the disapprove and the approval rates of both Biden and Congress, then you're unlikely to see any change. We had a war in Ukraine, and that really only that helped Biden temporarily by around 2 to 3 percentage points, but those gains have been reversed since then, and now Biden is at a negative 11% net approval rating. So yeah, there's really not much that can change between now and 2022, besides maybe an assassination of Joe Biden. I'm not saying an assassination should occur, but that seems like at this point the only way where Americans, or at least independents, might be more favorable to the Democratic Party. But the thing is, nothing has changed in terms of policy, nothing substantial at least, with inflation and other problems like oil prices. And we've seen that a lot of big moments like a war have not really changed the sentiment of the American public. So these numbers are likely to stay. And the Democrats at this point, whatever legislation they do between now and 2022, will purely just be because they wanted to do so. It's no longer, the Democrats should no longer issue or have an approach to legislation on the basis of winning the midterms, but rather set in a legacy for themselves in the next 10 years. So something like Obamacare from 2008 to 2010, that even though it kind of doomed them for the 2010 election, along with the lack of proper bank regulations and controls in the financial sector. Even though that helped collapse the Democrats in 2010, it left a lasting legacy that ultimately improved the Democrats and helped the Democrats win the House in 2018. So ultimately, that's really what the Democrats should be doing, but it's not like at this point, there's really not much they can do now to stop 2022 from happening. If we look at this map, even though the certain Democratic states like New Mexico and New York have gerrymandered their maps to be more in favor of the Democrats, those gains are very minor, especially because there are still competitive seats left. There are less than before, but there's still enough for the Republicans to have a sizable majority or a comfortable majority in the House. Washington's 8th District, for example, it's rated as an even seat by 538, so we're likely to see that seat flip to the Republican Party. In California, David Villaldo has shown that he's been able to win elections before in this Democratic district. Same with Mike Garcia. And then you have Michelle Steele, who's pretty popular with Asian American voters. And Nevada is shifting more to the right. And this is not only just the House. This is also likely to apply to the Senate, purely because Nevada has been shifting to the right. If we look at the Senate map, then you'll see that Georgia could flip to the Republican Party, but Pennsylvania could flip to the Democratic Party. New Hampshire is likely to stay Democratic because Sununu is not running there. Colorado is Democratic enough to not have an incumbency changed, and Mark Kelly is relatively popular in his state. But Nevada has been shifting more to the right in recent years. It's similar to Florida, since there was a big shift to the left between 2004 and 2008 made by Obama. But over the years, both states have shifted more and more to the right, which is mostly propelled by Latino voters who have shifted more to the right in those states. So what we see in polls between Adam Laxalt and Catherine Cortez Masto is that she, compared to Adam Laxalt has been winning in more of these polls. In a Democratic pollster, they said that Laxalt had a 7 percentage point lead over Catherine Cortez Masto. So that may purely be the reason why the Democrats lose the Senate majority in 2022. It's because they were not able to hold up in Nevada. But if you saw this title of the video, then you'll know that I vote. It doesn't really matter, and it really doesn't matter, because if we're looking at what's happening right now in Congress, in the 117th Congress, you'll see that the Democrats haven't been able to do much between August and this period. They were trying to get Build Back Better to pass, but that failed. Because existing senators like Joe Manchin put a halt to those kinds of plans. And moderate members of Congress also caused a backlash against the BBB, the Triple B. So at this point, there's not really much progress that's being made in the House or the Senate. So we shouldn't really expect the same to happen or anything different to happen in 2022 if the Democrats somehow keep the majorities in both the House and the Senate. But and in fact, it might actually benefit them to have the Republicans gain some kind of control over the House. Now, this is probably conjecture and an optimistic point of view, but but there are certain Republicans who are willing to make concessions and who are willing to make compromises. As far-fetched as that may seem, there are people like Peter Mayer and as well as Brian Fitzpatrick who are willing to make bipartisan advances. And the Democrats could rely on that still in the 2022 to 2024 period. So it's not like that the Trump-backed Republicans will have a complete control over the House. The Democrats shouldn't really be too worried about a Republican majority, because a lot of their members of Congress are fine with working with the Democrats, at least a few of them. Not all, obviously not the majority of the Republican Party, but there are certain members, and there are enough members that the Democrats can use to work on bills. In the Senate, Susan Collins is an example, maybe Lisa Murkowski, but that's unsure given that she's in a tough election period. But yeah, so look, the Democrats will lose the House and the Senate, and probably the Senate, and that would be a big disappointment for the Democratic Party. But they really should just embrace it at this point and figure out what they should do past 2022, because after 2022 they can't grieve over it like the Republicans were able to in the 2020 election, because 2024 is going to be a very hard year for the Democratic Party. It's not because of the presidency, because Joe Biden, even though he is old and even though a lot of people really don't care for him, he'll probably be reelected, since there's such an incumbency advantage when it comes to presidential elections. But the bigger fear will come over the Senate. So in 2024, a bunch of Democratic Senate seats will be up that were from 2018. So in red states like Ohio and Montana and West Virginia. So that's what the Democrats should really be worried about. 2022, at this point, there's not much they can do to stop it, so they should stop worrying about 2022. But they can still do things to stop a red wave in 2024 and to reverse potential gains by the Republicans. But yeah, I mean, at this point, the Democrats shouldn't be worried about the 2022 election, and that's all that matters at this point for their party. The Republicans should be pretty happy about 2022, given that 2020, they were expecting a lot of losses and they didn't, and now they're expecting to regain the House. So this is the map, by the way, that I have of which seats will go to the Democrats and which seats will go to the Republican parties. I did not include Florida yet just because I don't have time to, but basically this is what I would say would be the map. There are several flips made. Oh, I also forgot about New York, but New York, Nicole Malliotakis' seat will probably go blue just because it's Democratic enough for it to do so. And what other seats are there? I think that's it. But basically, yeah, the Republicans get a majority. Will probably get a majority from the Florida seats, and then the Democrats will stick around with around 200 seats. So that's the map. Democrats shouldn't really be worrying about the 2022 election, even though it's inevitable that they will lose. And that contributes to why they shouldn't be worrying. And they should be more worried about 2024. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.